It's the Misfits.
I was actually confessed Christ as Lord as a young child. Grew up in church, but didn't really know the Lord. But I knew church. I studied the Bible. I actually gave my first sermon at 12 years old. But from that point, began to drift and live my life just like everybody else. I call it, I was just living. I was just living. And it wasn't until almost 30 that I went through a very tough time in my marriage and realized that this is not the life that I should be living, that the Lord had more for me. And I made I believe, my true commitment. Although I prayed the prayer, when I was young and got baptized and all those things, I really believe that my genuine commitment, my genuine choice to follow Jesus happened at 30 years old. And when that happened, I began to walk with him. Friends and family looked at me and said, wow, how did you just change? And I really believe it's because I made a true commitment to go after him, to live for Jesus. One of the scriptures that stands out to me is that if anyone desires to come after me, must first deny himself, pick up his cross and follow me. That's the cost of discipleship. And I really made that decision, and I pushed forward. I was reading the Bible day and night. I would fall asleep with the Bible on my pillow. That's how many hours I would just spend just reading and praying and seeking the Lord and just asking him to really come into my life and be a part of my life and to lead my life. As I said, I was in a marital storm, and the Lord restored my marriage and began to lead my family. And I have stacks and stacks of journal entries from that time because it was so formative in who I am today. There was just a true commitment, almost a Damascus Road type experience, where once I made that commitment, everything changed. And it changed in such a dramatic fashion that people looked at me and said, man, who are you? You are a true different person. And I wrote that in my journal, that I am truly changed. I am truly a different person. I am not the person that I was. In Christ, I am a new creation. Old things have passed away, and behold, everything is truly new. The way I saw life, the way I treated my wife, the way I fathered my children, everything changed. The way I talked, the way I thought. And it was dramatic for a lot of people. They were just like, wow, this is amazing. 1 minute, my friend Jonathan, he tells me all the time that 1 minute I was playing Madden and having a beer, and the next minute I was witnessing to them and sharing the gospel with them, and it just was an amazing time. And I think that, thinking back to that true call to faith, I do believe that I meant what I said when I was young, but the true commitment to follow Christ didn't happen until I was an adult.
It's the Misfits.
Hey everybody, welcome back. We're finally back. We have had to take about a month break due to my wife breaking her ankle and me having to become full-time nurse for a period. But we're back. We've got Joe. We've got Aunt Wilson with us. We're going to be talking some seasonal topics here today. Quick update though, as far as what's been going on, because the last time that I was on, we had Joel Bowman, and we were talking about Law and Order. We were going to be talking about mental health. We were also going to be talking about fantasy football. We were going to be talking about a bunch of these different things. Fantasy football is not happening this year. Unfortunately, due to the injury, we've had to just put that off to the side for this year. What is going to be happening, though, is Joel Bowman will be coming back. We are still going to have the mental health discussion. If you don't want to wait that long, you should go over to his guest page, Brian Hudson's guest page on our website, or go onto any of their or mine social medias, and you can listen to a discussion that Dr. Hudson and Joel Bowman had dealing with Christians and mental health, especially related to the African American community. He's also planning on coming back. We're still going to have the gun violence and mental health discussion for Patreon and all that. We're also Patreon supporters. We are in the works of getting the next set of Bible studies ready to go. That won't be published here in the near future, but it will be published. So if you want to be a part of the Bible studies, the Galatian one is still up. You just got to go to Patreon and become a supporter at any level, and you can enjoy those. But today, we're back. We've got a full episode. Joe is back with us because he just can't get enough of us. And this time, if those of you that have watched Kingdom on the Road recognize Anthony Wilson, he's here as well. For some reason, he decided he can't get enough of this either. So he's decided to come on and we're going to do this. We are talking today. We're what, 2 weeks out from Halloween?
About that.
You know how I am with calendars.
Yeah.
2 weeks out from Halloween when we're recording this. We're going to talk about fear. And we are specifically going to talk about the difference between biblical fear and what everybody wants to talk about this time of year. Because again, this is part of the discussion. Brandon and I had this discussion last year. Joe and I had this discussion for Is It Pagan as well, as far as whether or not Halloween was pagan, whether it was something Christians could do, all this different stuff. We may cover a little bit of the same stuff in that, but specifically this time we're going to be looking at the aspect of fear related to all of this. So the first question for that then is, Aunt Joe, why is it that some people actually like to feel scared, especially this time of year?
So I actually talked to my wife about this before coming on because she is a horror story narrator, author, and a Christian, and as also somebody myself being a long time horror movie fan, and that didn't like subside after becoming a Christian. You know, there's something about the chemical response that happens when you're watching a high tense situation play out in on the screen or on the page, where you aren't in the actual event happening, because that's something different. You know, you could talk about the haunted houses and all of that kind of stuff, where people like the physical aspect of it as well. But more often than not, when you're talking about this sort of thing, you're talking about being a spectator to the actual events. And so there's a chemical response that happens when somebody is put in this situation of either a high tense situation or watching the story unfold, that elicits that at least a subdued version of the fight or flight response, in a way that it allows people to get lost in the moment and lost in the story.
Yeah, I would agree that fear is a distraction. For some people, it's a great distraction. It's a way to kind of leave their reality and go to a place of fantasy and fun. And it's I grew up watching horror movies. I'm not as much as I used to, but I grew up off of the classics. Actually, on Netflix just recently, I watched the documentary on, I forget what it's called, What Makes Us Afraid, or Why Are We Afraid? And they went through, the old Michael Myers Halloween and why that was so popular. And
Yep.
It was so interesting. I really enjoy watching the making of that movie, how they did it. And, it's cheesy, it's back then, but it's classic. And there's just something about, that adrenaline rush, as Joe said, that being afraid, it's just like laughter. Laughter has the same effect, that some people just like to laugh. And so they watch comedies. It's an escape. It's an opportunity to safely, enjoy something that you wouldn't really want to experience that in real life, but through the screen, through the movies, we can, have a good time and be scared. you know
And it also adds to it allows for a vehicle to be able to tell a grander story. You look at something like
Right.
Halloween.
Right.
It was originally called the Babysitter Murders. And so it was this idea of just
Right.
the shape, this fate, this amorphous, unstoppable thing just coming to kill babysitters and all of that. And there's a lot of versions along the way, even dating back to the Universal monster movies, that if you watch those movies, each one of those movies has subtext. They're all telling a story behind the horror elements of it.
Right.
But all in all, it's this vehicle for people to be able to explore in a way that is not just sitting there watching a TED talk on the topic. It's something a little bit more engaging, a little bit more fun.
Yeah, and let me add this, because I'm glad you said that. It allows us to safely and maybe even innocently engage the supernatural, right? It's
Yeah.
like, oh, I get to kind of mess around in that area, without really any major consequences. And so people enjoy the supernatural. There's, I grew up, and I don't know if I could, I'll share this real quick. I grew up reading, believe it or not, parapsychology books. Right? You're like, what is a 11, 12, 13-year-old doing reading that? But
With it being you, I fully believe that.
Yeah.
But there was a fascination with the supernatural, and just the fact that they're just behind the layer of my reality was something else. And movies, horror movies and things like that kind of lets you peek behind that curtain a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
Well, and one of the key things you keep saying, Ant, is this idea of the fact that it's done safely.
Mm-hmm.
Which that is the big piece to what we're about to get into when we talk about the biblical idea of fear. Because when we actually talk about fear, we're not actually talking about anything that we just talked about in reality.
Right.
There's a major difference between feeling scared and feeling fear. And one of the big keys to that, according to Webster's, is the fact that fear is defined as unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that someone or something dangerous is coming, or is likely to cause pain, or is a threat. That is not any kind of safely idea. That's the big difference between this idea of fear and scared. So the first thing that, if nothing else, that you can get from this discussion is the fact that just the idea of wanting to feel scared is not anything to do with the idea of fear being sinful, which we hear thrown around this time of year. We're not saying fear is sinful, and that's part of what we're going to get into. But when you have people that are going to argue that Halloween itself is a problem because it promotes fear, fear is not actually what we're talking about when we're talking about why people enjoy Halloween. They enjoy the feel of being scared, which is what Joe was talking about, the dopamine rush, the feeling of the unknown, what Ant's even the idea of the storytelling, which I'm sure most people are not going to psychoanalyze it as much as you do, Joe, with the idea of the storytelling side of it. But that's just that's what you do. But those sort of things are not actually something that most people have a fear of. It's just they want the feeling of being scared.
Right.
So biblically, we need to actually then define what we mean when we talk about this idea of what fear is, because of the fact that people are going to throw around the idea that being afraid is sinful. Mm-hmm. So, and you probably already have all these known, but within the New Testament, we've got two words specifically that come into play when we're dealing with this. The first one is phobos, which most people should be able to figure out that that's something related to fear, because that's where we get the idea of phobias from.
Mm-hmm.
but it means panic, flight, fear, the causing of fear, or terror. And there's two different ways it can be used. One of them is in a positive way of the fear of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to emphasize that's a positive, and we'll get to why that's a positive in a minute. And the other one is fear in terms of what we were talking about earlier, as far as it's an unpleasant thing. The reason why both of these are used both in a positive and a negative is because of the fact that both of these actually are talking about withdrawing from something.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the part that people don't normally associate with fear. So the fear of the Lord is a drawing near to God. That's a positive thing. You are fearing God, and so you want to come closer because of the fact that he's the one that is the source of safety, the source of comfort, the source of peace. So the opposite of that would be withdrawing from the Lord. And so that brings with it fears of panic, terror, all these bad things that we were talking about. And is that a good breakdown of what we actually mean when we talk about the fear of the Lord? Because I think that's the first thing we need to actually get straight, is what we mean when people say you should only fear God. What do we actually mean when we're talking about fearing God?
Yeah, I think you're right on. Of course, yeah, the idea is that we withdraw even from sinful things, not because we're afraid of the thing, but we have a reverence for God that causes us to pull away from things that are displeasing to the Lord, because we reverence him, because we want to please him. And so there's this idea of fleeing from, I don't know, sexual immorality in the fear of the Lord, because I'm doing that in the fear of the Lord, not because I'm afraid of sexual immorality, but in the fear of the Lord, in the desire to respect and honor God, I withdraw from this. But then you have the opposite, like you said, where you withdraw from the Lord because you fear him with dread. And that's which is different. That's not honor or respect. It's like, nah, I don't know if this is a good example, but there'll be people that say to me, "Man, I'm not going to the church because it'll burn down if I go in there."
Right.
You hear people say that, and you're like, "Well, no." They're like, "Nah, I'm good. I can't." Why are they saying that? It's like in the Old Testament when they were at Mount Sinai, remember, and the Lord spoke, and they said, "Moses, don't let the Lord speak to us anymore. You go up there, you talk to him. We don't want to hear the Lord's voice." There was a fear, but that's not the fear that God wants. He wants the fear of respect and love, which transforms you, not a fear that has you in superstition. And superstition is what causes what we would call a false religion, where you're doing things that I don't do this and I don't do that because I'm afraid God's going to get me.
Well, it's a lot of that is what, when we talk about it with these terms, at least on here, as far as the difference between the Christocentric gospel and the hell-centric.
Right.
Is
That's exactly where I was going to go, that this is part of why it's so important to make a distinction, and why sometimes the people of a certain vintage in this conversation sound like, oh, we're just trying to buck back against the older generation by revolting against the way that it was done before us, sort of thing. But even in terms of thinking about this in a generational sense, it loses the potency of the importance of fighting back against this idea of hellfire and brimstone, this idea of turn and burn, this idea of, do this or else sort of mentality. Because if you scare somebody into the pew,
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'll equate it back to horror movies. I still to this day remember I was 5 years old and I watched Nightmare on Elm Street for the first time, and I had to pause it. Like, there was a scene in it, and I still to this day remember the scene. It got me. Now, I will be the first one to admit, at this point in my life, I've realized I started watching horror movies too young. I get it. But
So don't send him any letters, is what he's
Right.
saying.
yeah, I understand. But the 90s were a different time, guys. But that now I watch those things and it doesn't elicit the same sort of fearful response that it once did. If you scare somebody into the church, eventually that fear is going to die down, something along those lines. Eventually, the counterbalance of, oh, is my main motivation for doing all of this church stuff just a fear of God? Eventually that's going to wear off, and more often than not lead to somebody just being like, oh, okay, this wasn't real in the first place. Somebody just wanted to use a scare tactic on me. And the reality is, guys, is that big angry God in the sky that generally gets concocted around the turn and burn stuff, that God isn't real. That's surely not the God of the Bible. It's a caricature.
It's a pagan God is what it is. It's a pagan God. Because the pagan gods had to have worship in order to have their power.
Right.
And so in order to ensure worship, they had to instill fear. And not in a positive way of drawing near to them. It was in a way of forcing the people to withdraw from them to the point that they then had to worship them in order to get what they needed. Right. That's the pagan model.
And it's an important distinctive that Ant's drawing out, because if you've listened to us on Kingdom on the Road, if you've listened to the Love Thy Neighbor, if you've listened to Buddy Walk, if you've listened to really anybody in the network, you're going to hear this common thread of this deep, nuanced, rich relationship with God. That's so evidenced all over Old and New Testament. And this kind of respect and reverence sort of dynamic that happens between creator and created, that's the stuff that leads to understanding the foundation of why grace and mercy are so important, why this relationship is so awe-inspiring, why you hear me say so often, dude, can we stop circling the drain for 30 seconds and take a step back and really take stock of the fact that what we're talking about here is a relationship between the creator of everything and his creation, when we have systematically and entirely screwed the pooch on this thing.
And that's where, the argument and the pushback that we normally get is, well, where do we see that idea in the Bible? Because Jesus talks about hell. And so we should too. This is what this is what Isaiah 6 actually talks about. Is you have Isaiah taken before the throne of the Creator. All he sees and hears is just pure, unadulterated worship. And immediately his response is, woe is me, I'm a man of unclean lips.
Yes.
Yep.
There was no threat made to him of turn and burn or fire and brimstone. The idea of seeing the Creator inspired a terror in himself to recognize how he has sinned against that awesome being. And because of that, the angel flies over, touches his lips with the colt, and says, see, now your sin has been taken away. And immediately he is, instead of it being fearful and in terror, he now has the courage to be able to say, here I am, send me. Because the fear of the Lord is what actually gave him strength, not the fear of judgment. It was the fear of God and the fact that he was so holy and we are not, but yet we can have a relationship there.
Yeah, Andrew, can I jump in there just a
Yeah.
second, just on that same vein? In Ezekiel chapter 1, at the end of Ezekiel, he sees just this amazing, awesome scenery, right? And then he finally hears the voice of the Lord, right?
Mhm.
And the Bible says that he falls to the ground. Strength leaves his body at just hearing the voice of the Lord. That is true. What we're talking about when we talk about fear, that the power, the presence, the immense glory of God reveals everything about you that is not that, right? And so, like you said, I don't need hell to do that. I need God's presence to do that. If we're just selling fire insurance, then everybody will jump on board. Some people will say, well, I'll take my risk, but most people would take fire insurance, right? But what we're talking about is we're talking about honoring God, living for God, seeing God as the treasure, the target, the aspiration of our life. I think it was Paul that says that in my presence, was it? Yeah, Philippians 2, verse 12, he says, in my presence you obey, but now much more in my absence. He says, work out your own soul salvation with fear and trembling, right? With fear and trembling. But the next verse kind of settles you, because he says, knowing that it is God that works in you both the will and to do what pleases him. And so this fear and trembling is just this awestruck understanding of how great and glorious God is. He doesn't even mention hell.
Right.
you know
And that's where we get into what the second word that gets us, we need to talk about related to the aspect of biblical fear actually is, which is normally translated to anxiousness instead. And that's merimneo, which is just to care for so much that it distracts you, which can be in some cases, I guess, a good thing, because you care for it so much that it distracts you from everything else. But ultimately, it's this idea of the fact that you are caring for something so much that it distracts you from everything that we just talked about. So, with that idea of fear, that it produces anxiety rather than producing repentance and worship, what does the Bible actually say about fear within the idea of Christian living?
Well, I guess I'll jump in. you know, there's two things, and I'm glad you brought up marineo, because that's the term used in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 6, where he says, "Be anxious for nothing," right? But with prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, make your requests known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard or keep your hearts and minds. That term, and I'm going to take the definition a little bit farther, is that type of fear causes you to go to pieces.
Mm-hmm.
It causes you to come apart. Right? You're divided within yourself. You're struggling within yourself, and the only antidote to that is peace. When you find peace in God, then the fears of this life go away. The anxiety then goes away. I think it's Isaiah 26:3. He says, I will
26:3,
keep
yeah.
them, I will keep them in perfect peace, right? Whose
Mm-hmm.
mind is stayed on me because you trust me. These verses are meant to settle you and calm you, right? When you're fearful, that's the issue, is that you're unsettled, you're uncalm, you're incomplete, you're struggling to figure out what should I feel, what shouldn't I feel. And so when we look at the Bible, fear in the sense of the Lord is supposed to bring about peace. It's supposed to bring about wholeness. It's supposed to bring about direction, because the fear of the Lord is what? The beginning of wisdom, which is totally opposite of the fear of losing, the fear of what's going to happen to me, the fear of the unknown. I mean, fear is something that, for me, believe it or not, I grew up with a lot of fear. I feared if I would do well. I feared if I would do bad. I feared if I would win. I would fear if everything was fearful. There was always something to fear. There was always something, because there was always something unknown. There was always something that I was unsure of. I don't know what's next. And so anxiety, I don't know if you have ever felt those butterflies, being an athlete before the big game or the big fight or the big event, even coaching. I'm standing on the sideline. I'm actually not going to be on the field, and I still got those butterflies, like, oh, here we go, and it's like there's this fear of the unknown. And I think when we trust God, we are walking, by faith, trusting him with the unknown and knowing that he's known. And so as we know him, we don't worry about the unknown anymore, because we know him. And so that's why the goal is to put our trust in him and not worried about tomorrow, because today's got enough to deal with. And so when I think about fear, in a biblical sense, what raises fear is the unknown. What I'm worried about happening. Sometimes people say fear is what? False evidence appearing real, right? That's what I used to hear, coming up. And I'm like, is that really? I don't know. It's pretty cliche and it's pretty cool, but at the same time, it is about the unknown. I fear things that I don't know or I don't understand.
So to piggyback off of what Ant said, I want to read on, because he grabbed the verse that I was going to go to, but I want to read a little bit further.
Sorry about
than 3. No, it's all good. So starting at 3, you will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast, because they trust in you. Trust in the Lord forever, for the Lord himself is the rock eternal. He humbles those who dwell on high. He lays the lofty city low. He levels it to the ground and casts it down to dust. When we talk about God's will, when we talk about the kingdom of God, when we talk about these different concepts that center around the cooperation between creator and created, we are getting at this idea of man engaging with God to bring about the wholeness of man through God. And so when we talk about things like anxiety and we talk about things like fear, these are the moments where it is incredibly crucial to leave your 2023 idea of anxiety at the door. Don't bring disorders into it, because that's a different conversation. Don't bring modern context into it, because that's a different conversation. Let's eat what's on the plate when trying to figure out, okay, if we're going to ask these questions, let's find out, what does the Bible actually say about fear and anxiousness? And I keep going back to so many points in my life have gone back to this idea, even before I was a Christian, when I was just going through the beats of church. I still was brought back to Isaiah 26:3. And when we look at the realities of this life, that the way as Christians and why so many of the alternatives fall to pieces almost immediately is because they are not centered on this idea of being brought to a state of peace and wholeness by way of God. That it is turning away from those things that distract us. Y'all, the last 2 months alone have been chock full of an ice cream shop's worth of different versions of distractions and issues and heartaches and tragedies of varying degrees. Like, that stuff's real. We're not trying to hide behind a Bible verse to say that life isn't real and that life isn't a meat grinder. But at the same token, everything that we're talking about, the things that Andrew has said, the things that Ant has said, the things that I have said, they're not hyperbolic language. That's the beauty of what we're getting at here when we talk about these relationship pieces. Is if for as real as the meat grinder is, as real this peace and relationship is as well.
And the key thing that both of you have said, but without actually saying it, is what really at the end of the day separates out the definition of anxiety and the definition of fear with what it actually looks like within a Christocentric living mindset, a kingdom mindset. Because the piece that you never actually said, but you did, was the fact that the Spirit is involved with all of this. Because every single piece of how you're supposed to go about feeling instead of anxiety was things like love and peace, which are fruits of the Spirit. The fear of the unknown versus knowing who God is, which is, the wisdom of God is the Spirit of God. All of these sort of things piecing together. And part of what Joe just said is the other difference between anxiety in terms of what Paul is saying do not have, and anxiety in terms of the neurological conditions that we now know are real.
Right.
Because the biblical sin of anxiety is this idea of distracting ourselves with our fears.
Yeah.
That cause us to withdraw from the Lord.
Right.
But that's not what it looks like when we talk about living in the Spirit, a Christocentric mindset of a renewed mind out of Romans 12. We are able to not distract ourselves. We are able to recognize the problems around us, but not allow it to distract us to the point of withdrawing from God, but instead finding that peace and finding the joy and finding the love within those situations rather than withdrawing ourselves away from them. That even in many ways goes back to what we even started with as to why people like to feel scared. Because we said it's a dopamine hit. It's a feeling of excitement. It's a feeling of all these things. That's part of what we are talking about when we actually are able to say that we have experienced the peace of the Lord. Not in a dopamine hit sort of way, but in a much more real, permanent way of being able to say in the midst of tragedy, in the midst of anxiety, in the midst of the unknown, that we know that God is here with us. And we're able to have the courage to say, "Here I am, send me." So, Joe, Ant, before we start to close up, is there anything else that we didn't hit within this that you think we need to jump on real fast and keep trucking through?
I'll just say that when trying to separate out what all of this means and do this with a level of authenticity, this is difficult enough even without trying to also lay in these ideas and oftentimes misconceptions of, is this holiday sinful, are these activities sinful, and trying to also sort through all that aspect of it as well. So really the thing that I would say is, be willing to use free resources, because these resources that we've been using today, you can find any and all of them free online, and do some due diligence to sort out what's happening here. And then, if you have not already, engage with the Bible as a continuous story,
Mm-hmm.
as one big story, because there, without compartmentalizing it, without segmenting it, that is where you can jump in and say, wow, this story has led to my redemption and ultimately this relationship with God.
Yeah, I would add to that. Um, Understand that the fear of God is transformative, and as it relates to the holiday season, it's important for us to focus on our relationship with God
Mm-hmm.
and not impose our issues on other people, right? Because to one degree, a person may say, man, it's what's the big deal? Another person says, oh, no, you can't do this, you can't do that. Is that fear of the Lord, or is that fear of something else? Right? Is that fear of, I think any fear that is not focused on relationship with God is harmful.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I can say straight out it's sinful, right? But I can say that if I'm afraid to miss morning prayer, even though that's a good thing, right? If I'm afraid to miss it, is that because of my relationship with God, or is that I'm just afraid to not succeed in what I'm trying to do? You see what I'm saying? That you can begin to focus your fear on things and it not be a reverence for God. I think it's
Mhm.
I think it's Colossians. It's Colossians where he talks about a false humility,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where it's touch not, taste not, handle not. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that. And it appears like wisdom, but it is actually not beneficial to change your life. And so we want to get to the place where this relationship with God is fruitful, and it helps and it governs how we approach things and even how we approach people, because so many things are done out of fear.
Mm-hmm.
We parent out of fear. We have relationships out of fear. I was just talking to somebody the other day where we're loving from a defensive posture.
Yep.
You're loving somebody with your guard up,
Mm-hmm.
you know, because there's fear involved, you know, even in me trying to love somebody. And so, fear has that way of creeping into everything in anything. And I would go back to your verse, um, uh, Joe, Isaiah 26:3, and I would focus my attention on the Lord and let him guide me, even throughout this season. I have a daughter who loves haunted houses and all that kind of stuff, and you let her do that. I was like, she's grown. you know she's
Yeah.
grown. She wants to go to a haunted house, she can go to a haunted house. Don't impose your fear of what's going on other people. And I think, yeah, that's a whole nother discussion that we don't actually have time for.
Well, it's not even a separate discussion, because it's what we just were talking about. Because this idea, the fact that if you are imposing your fear on other people because you fear your relationship with God is not where it's supposed to be, or that their relationship with God is not where it's
Right.
supposed to be, normally that is done out of the place of the fear of judgment. not the
There
fear
it
of
is.
the Lord.
Yes, and I had just pulled that up.
Right.
1 John 4:18. Yep.
Right. And 1 John 4:18, perfect love casts out fear.
Right.
And when we're talking about living our lives, whether you want to use the term kingdom-centered, whether you want to use the term Christocentric, which both are dealing with the same kingdom and the same king, if we are living that way and we are allowing the Spirit to be our wisdom, then the wisdom that we are presenting to other people, one, is not going to be imposed on other people. Because that is not how God draws people to himself. And it is also going to be one that does not promote anxiety, but is going to promote the fruits of the Spirit within us. Joe, you were going to say something.
Yeah, just because I tend to be the voice of, let's make sure that people understand that we are not stepping outside of the realms of human existence and the realities of human existence and the complications of human existence. I'll be the first one to admit there are people that immediately jump to my mind when I start thinking about this idea of loving from a defensive posture. Humans are screwed up individuals. That's just a reality. We all have bad habits. We've all done things wrong. We've all hurt other people. And sometimes there are very real events that have led to loving from a defensive posture. Right. So please do not hear what Ant is not saying. For those of you that are longtime listeners of Misfits, you guys have heard me on here multiple times at this point. Andrew and I do not hide the fact that we deeply do ministry together. Well, Ant and I also deeply do ministry together. Right. And so I come in with that voice of, he's not discrediting whatever it is that you've gone through that leads to that. The point is we are building up God and his love and his relationship and the transformative nature of the Spirit to the point to supersede that for a reason, because that, friends, is the dichotomy.
Amen.
Speaking of doing ministry together, if you want to catch more of this discussion, basically, there's going to be a new episode of Is It Pagan coming out here soon with the three of us, because apparently we just have decided we're just going to do everything together now. The three of us, we're going to be walking through. Last year, Joe and I did just Halloween in general. We tried to do one on the spiritual realm with Brother Matthew, and somehow it got lost, and we have no idea where it went.
The spirits took it.
The spirits took it. So we're going to try and redo that again this year. And so if you haven't already, if you go to the Misfits YouTube channel and look in our playlist, you will find a playlist that is titled Is It Pagan? You can also go to the website. If you go to the website, there under the video tab, you'll find the Is It Pagan playlist. Joe and I apparently inadvertently decided to do this for like every holiday, where we're just going to go through and diagnose them all. So this year we're going to do Halloween again, but we're going to redo something we tried to do and the spirits took last year. So if you want that, go check that out. You can also catch all three of us, sometimes with Brother Matthew, sometimes just a big shuffle of whoever remembers to get on for the morning, over on Kingdom on the Road. That's available on pretty much all of our YouTube channels, all of our Facebooks. It's also on me and Brother Matthew's Twitters. You can find all of those. Right now we're doing a series of going through and walking through the Old Testament and trying to demystify, in a lot of ways, what we just did here about fear, but with some of the bigger topics like, what do you do with the story of Dinah, which is what we spent 3 hours doing last week. So go check all that out. Do that. You can catch Ant over at Love Thy Neighbor. What are you walking through right now, Ant?
Right now I'm kind of just doing interviews with different people. I was walking through Love for a while, And so you can check those out. I did a series on love and, the power of love, the unconditional love of God. And so you can go back and check those out. That was a series that I was doing, getting ready to do a few interviews of ministry partners that I've worked with on different subjects. So it'll be just a lot of interviews coming up over the next couple of weeks.
Awesome. Then you also know there's like 80,000 different projects at one time that's going on with Joe. But Joe, what's
Right.
going on with Buddy Walk? You finally have finished Matthew since the last time we've talked. Since the last time we talked to you, you finished the book of Matthew. So what are we doing now?
So right now, I'm going back and re-hitting some of the concepts that we hit along the way or early on. Now that the full picture has been painted, and hitting some of the touchstone points within the series. So this is kind of like the epilogue portion of Matthew right now, and then I'm getting ready to announce what the next series is going to be.
So if you didn't get enough in the last 18 months of the book of Matthew, Joe is still doing the book of Matthew over on Buddy Walk with Jesus, buddywalkwithjesus.com, YouTube, all those good stuff. You can check it all out on the guest portal, Ant's guest portal. Hopefully will be up by the time you're listening to this, but we all know how that goes. So speaking of, we are semi-back, Misfits. We are semi-back. Hopefully we will have Brandon on next week doing the opposite of today's topic. We're going to keep walking through the fruits of the Spirit, looking at faith. One that we had advertised we were going to do a month or two ago, and then you know how that went. We're still going to have Joel Bowman come back and do mental health. We're still going to have Joel come back, and we're going to talk mental health and gun violence. I think there's like 3 other topics since the last time we talked to him that he's invited himself on to talk about as well. So you'll see a lot of Joel. You'll see a lot of Joe. Hopefully we'll see some more of Ant as well. We've also got a few other guests getting ready to come on as well. During our little break period, we had quite a few people saying, well, once you're ready, let me know. So we will be back, if not fully on schedule again, at least mostly on schedule. We're hoping to have 1 or 2 more blogs coming out here soon as well, including one dealing with some of the stuff we talked about today. So, Joe, Ant, thanks for coming on. Thanks for doing this. We're going to jump over and start doing Is It Pagan here in a couple of minutes. But for the rest of you, we will see you whenever we get around to actually recording another episode.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Ministry Misfit Media in association with Overwhelming Victory. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. The Ministry Misfits theme song is written and produced by J.D. Laird and Laird Creative Agency. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also visit our website at www.ministrymisfits.com or through bio.link/ministrymisfits. If you would like to support Ministry Misfits, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/ministrymisfits.